In this session on employment income, we're going to look at the distinction between employment and self-employment. Now, in most cases, it's pretty clear whether someone is employed or whether they're self-employed. And this distinction matters for a number of reasons. Firstly, because there is a lot of employment legislation which applies to employees which would not apply to those who are self-employed. So, for example, an employer would pay sick pay to an employee if they are off through sickness, but they would not pay sick pay to, say, their accountant. It also matters because income from employment and self-employment is taxed very differently. Now, the basic distinction between employment and self-employment comes down to the nature of the contract between the different parties. We have what's called a contract of service. Now, this is an employment contract, and it's where someone is being employed to do certain types of work. The focus here is more on the input, the labour input, than it is on the output. We also have contract for services, and this is a self-employment contract. And here, perhaps, we are focusing more on the outputs of the labour involved and the work involved. The trouble is that sometimes the distinction between these two different types of contracts is not particularly clear. And in these cases, what we do is we consider the circumstances and then come to a decision. The first factor that we should take into account when making our decision between employment and self-employment is what's called mutuality of obligations. And here we've got to ask ourselves, do both parties to the contract have obligations to the other? So, for example, is it expected that work is going to be provided by one party to the other? And if so, is it also expected that the worker will accept the work? Now, if both parties have obligations to the other, this does indicate that an employment contract exists. The second factor that I'll mention is that of control. Here we consider the amount of control that the person has over their own work. So, does the person take orders as to how the work is done, when and where the work is done? If the answer is yes, they do take orders as to all of these factors, then this indicates employment. The greater the control the person has over how, where and when the work is done, the more likely they are to be self-employed. Thirdly, we'll consider risk. Now, is the person risking their own money in their work? And do they bear the cost of correcting any work that's done poorly? If so, it indicates self-employment. If, however, they're not risking any of their own money in doing the work, or someone else will pay for the cost of correcting any work, then that would indicate employment. Another factor to take into account is whether or not the worker provides their own equipment. Now, when we're considering own equipment, we would typically ignore things like hand tools and small equipment. So, for instance, a builder would not be considered a self-employed because they brought their own trowel to work. But if the answer is yes, then again this indicates self-employment. A further factor to take into account is whether or not the worker has the right of substitution. What we mean by this is, do they have the right to send another person to do the work instead of themselves? If the answer is yes, this is a strong indicator of self-employment. Finally, I'll just mention one or two other matters. So, for instance, does the person receive sick pay, holiday pay and overtime? And do they work regular hours? Unsurprisingly, if that is the case, then this indicates employment. We might also consider whether the person just works for one other party. Again, if so, it's a strong indicator of employment. But if they're working regularly for lots of others, then that would be an indicator of self-employment. We've been through a variety of different factors, and you might be thinking, well, in practice what happens is that one of those factors points towards self-employment, another points towards employment, and so on. So we might be unsure. And this is not surprising because these things can be complicated, and none of the factors that we've mentioned previously are conclusive by themselves. Ultimately, it comes down to the court's decision as to what is or isn't employment.